So the second question I'm going to answer is keeping with the theme of questions that you will probably get asked in your first conversation about Quakerism. So maybe this can be helpful for y'all. And this one comes from Denise, a friend in Ann Arbor who went to a Quaker college, has worked with a lot of Quaker organizations, and said that she's never really been able to get a solid answer to this question. And that's the question is, are Quakers Christian? I guess in keeping with the tradition of the Quakers that she experienced, the best that I can say is that Quakers are a part of the Christian tradition. I don't think it is essential that Quakers are Christian. There are certainly Quakers who identify deeply as Christian. There are certainly Quakers who identify as non-theist, or Quakers who identify as, to some extent, anti-theist. And we'll get into that a little bit later with a question about atheism. But to go into that a little bit further, I want to sort of point to three things. So the first one is the history of Quakerism and their sort of founding. So Quakerism was a theological movement that came out of the period of the English Civil War, and that was a time of great upheaval. People saw things were changing all over, and that seemed pretty consistent with the notion that the world as we know it was going to end soon. And I think that a lot of us can probably relate to that today with COVID, and even before COVID, as Marx put it, the internal contradictions of the system are starting to show itself, and so Quakers had to deal with that, or people who I guess became Quakers had to deal with that notion of the world, and the language that they had available to them was the language of Christianity. I think many of them did deeply believe it, but I don't think it was necessary for them to believe it. They were trying to communicate an idea, and they had to use the tools they had available to themselves to communicate that idea in that time. Sort of the second thing is we can look to the example of the north of England at that time to really point to some of how this sort of linguistic aspect or the tools aspect of Christianity played out for Quakers. So London was obviously the seat of the empire. That was sort of where things were most strict. And as you got further and further away from London, the sort of religious authorities and what we might consider the police at that time, weren't really keeping that good of an eye on you. So you did have, even like secret Catholics in the north of England. But you also had a lot of folk religions, and Quakerism connected to those folk religions a lot better than other forms of Christianity did, because it sort of had this mystic element to it. It had this sort of, this personal relationship with the divine. And, they would have used the language Christ, but that language translated pretty well to these other religious traditions. So Quakerism does have a long history, even from its very beginning, of speaking sort of beyond what the traditional bounds of Christianity is. The third thing, which I know for Denise and I, this is probably a very relevant question, is what does it mean to call yourself a Christian as a Quaker? And for lots of people, Christianity represents trauma, represents histories of oppression, represents all kinds of things that were committed in the name of Christianity, but it also represents a departure from other identities. So Ben Dandelion talks, Ben Pink Dandelion, I should respect his goofy naming tradition, which I love, talks about in his book, An Introduction to Quakerism, experiences of Jewish people who got involved with Quakerism. And because their Jewish identity was such a strong source of power and tradition and hope for them, they wouldn't feel comfortable identifying as Christians, but might feel comfortable identifying as Quakers. And that sort of mindset could be applied across a wide variety of things, of people for whom Christianity represents something outside of their comfort zone, or even represents, a direct lineage of oppression for them. And with that in mind, it doesn't seem necessary to ask those people to identify as Christian, or to expect those people to identify as Christian. But that doesn't mean that they're not a part of Quakerism, and that doesn't mean that they're not a very important part of Quakerism. And in Ann Arbor specifically, if you look around or listen around to the loudest Quakers, a lot of them tend to come from a Jewish background, and I think that traditions of social justice and traditions of theological sources of power, much like they were for people in the north of England, are expressed very well within Quakerism for people regardless of whether they want to identify as Christians or not. And those people are all very valuable in the movement and are just as much, I should say the society, not the movement, are just as much of a part of that as people who don't carry that identifying, or don't carry that signifier for their identity.